Let me go. Do you know who I am? Alexander's voice trembled with suppressed rage, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. Daddy, sobbed little Sophia, clinging to her mother's hand. Why are they taking Daddy away? Victoria stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I swear I will destroy your career for what you did to my husband in front of my children. The young officer chuckled. One more word and you'll join him. You really don't know who you're arresting right now, do you? Alexander asked quietly, slowly raising his head. I'm a special agent of the FBI, head of the Counterterrorism unit, and I promise you, this day will be the biggest mistake of your life. The sun kissed the azure surface of the pool at the exclusive Golden Shores Resort in Malibu. This paradise, where the quiet rustling of palm leaves mingled with the gentle sound of the ocean waves, was a dream come true for any work-weary person. It was here that the Mitchell family finally managed to carve out a precious week for a long-awaited vacation. Alexander Mitchell, a 37-year-old FBI special agent in charge of the Counterterrorism unit, reclined on a lounge chair, letting the sun dance across his dark skin. His strong, trained body, accustomed to being constantly tense and ready for action, was finally able to relax. He closed his eyes and enjoyed a rare moment of peace, a luxury he rarely had in his normal life. Next to him, his wife Victoria, a prominent civil rights lawyer, was deep in the latest bestseller she had been promising herself for 6 months. Her graceful fingers turned the pages gently, and her long eyelashes cast shadows on her high cheekbones. She looked peaceful, although Alexander knew that even now on vacation, part of her mind was still analyzing the latest high-profile case she had won literally the day before leaving. Their children, Michael, 12, and Sophia, 7, were frolicking in the pool, their laughter ringing out across the grounds. Michael, who had inherited his father's height and his mother's insight, was protecting his sister from the splashes of other children, while little Sophia, with her curly brown hair and bright smile, splashed happily, feeling safe under her brother's watchful eye. For Alexander, these moments were priceless. After a difficult year filled with sleepless nights, dangerous operations, and constant stress, the opportunity to simply lie next to his beloved wife and watch the children play seemed like a real miracle. He knew that Victoria needed this rest as much as he did. Her work defending civil rights was emotionally draining, and the latest police brutality case had taken a lot out of her. You know, Alexander said quietly, turning to his wife, I can't remember the last time I felt this good. Just being here with you, without calls, without emergency surgeries, without the feeling that if I relax for a minute, someone might get hurt. Victoria smiled, putting the book down. Her brown eyes met his and she gently touched his hand. You deserve it, Alex. We all do. The last few months have been crazy. Her voice was soft, but there was a strength in it that Alexander always admired. Look at Michael and Sophia. They're so happy just to be with us. No nannies, no rush. No need to explain why Dad didn't show up for the school concert again, or Mom missed the parent-teacher conference. Alexander felt a pang of guilt. His work often took away time he should have spent with his family. How many times had he missed important moments in his children's lives? How many evenings had Victoria spent alone, waiting for him to return from yet another assignment? I promise this vacation will be all about us, he said firmly. No calls from work, no checking email, just us. Victoria smiled wider, and Alexander felt his heart fill with love. Even after 14 years of marriage, her smile still made him lose his breath. Their idyllic moment was interrupted by the appearance of a tall man in the dark uniform of a resort security guard. The man approached their lounge chairs slowly, his face impassive, but his eyes betraying poorly concealed suspicion. Alexander noticed him from afar, a professional habit of always assessing his surroundings, and something in the man's gait made him tense up inside. The guard stopped right in front of them, towering over them and casting a shadow over Victoria's face. Excuse me, sir, he began with false politeness. I need to check whether you are a guest of our resort. Alexander sat up slowly, maintaining an outward calm, although inside his head the alarm bells were already ringing. He knew that tone and that look well. In 15 years of service in the FBI, he had learned to recognize hidden prejudices and unfounded suspicions. Yes, we are guests, he answered calmly, looking the guard straight in the eyes. We arrived yesterday. Victoria put her book down, her relaxed posture turning guarded. She immediately felt the tension, and years of working on discrimination cases told her that something unpleasant was going on. The guard nodded but did not move. I need to know your room number, sir. It's procedure. Alexander remained calm, although the weariness of the familiar situation began to fill his being. Of course. We're in room 712, the Ocean Breeze Suite. The guard wrote the information down on his tablet, but instead of leaving with satisfaction, he continued to stand in place, studying Alexander and Victoria with poorly concealed mistrust. I need to verify this information. Wait here, he said finally and walked away, not taking his eyes off the family, as if expecting them to try to escape. Once the guard had moved a sufficient distance away, Victoria turned to her husband, her eyes narrowed in anger. I can't believe this is happening. Again. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. This is a luxury resort, Alex. We paid $6,000 for a week, and yet... She didn't finish the sentence, but Alexander didn't need to explain what she meant. It wasn't the first time their family had faced such treatment. No matter how successful they were, no matter what achievements they could boast of, there were always those who saw only the color of their skin and drew their own conclusions. Let them check, Alexander said wearily. Let's not ruin the children's vacation. He looked at the pool where Michael and Sophia were still playing, unaware of the tension that had built up around their parents. Alexander wanted to preserve their innocence for as long as possible, to protect them from the ugly realities of the world they had grown up in. But he also knew that one day they would have to face the same discrimination, and that knowledge caused him almost physical pain. Victoria sighed, her legal mind already analyzing the situation, preparing for a confrontation if necessary. But she also looked at the children and decided to follow her husband's advice. At least this time. She had already fought enough at her job, winning discrimination cases for her clients. Couldn't she take a week off from this fighting? The guard returned a few minutes later, but he was not alone. Another security officer was walking alongside him, younger, with a more aggressive gait and a self-assured grin on his face. They stopped in front of the lounge chairs, and the senior guard spoke in a tone that no longer attempted to hide his distrust. Sir, we must ask you and your family to leave the pool area until we confirm your identity with the administration, he announced, crossing his arms over his chest. Alexander slowly straightened up, his face remaining calm, although inside he was seething with anger. I don't understand. I already gave you our number. If you need confirmation, call the reception, but there is no reason to ask us to leave. The junior guard took a step forward, his posture defiant. We've had problems with people coming onto the property who aren't guests. It's a security procedure, he said in a condescending tone, as if explaining something to a child. Victoria rose from her chaise longue, her eyes blazing with anger. As a lawyer, she knew all too well when discrimination was hidden behind procedure. Procedure? She asked, not hiding her irony. And do you apply this procedure to all guests or only to those like us? She gestured toward the pool area, where dozens of other vacationers, mostly white, were enjoying the sun and water without any checks. The junior guard tensed, his face turning slightly red with irritation. Ma'am, we do not discriminate against our guests. We are simply doing our job. Then do it right, Victoria snapped. Call the front desk and confirm our information. We're not going anywhere. Michael, noticing the tense conversation between his parents and the guards, climbed out of the pool and approached them, pulling Sophia along with him. His young face expressed anxiety and incomprehension. Mom, what's going on? He asked, instinctively sensing the danger in the situation. Victoria tried to soften her expression, not wanting to scare the children. Nothing, dear. Just a little misunderstanding with security. Everything is fine. But Michael was old enough to know that all was not well. He could see his father tense, and his mother's eyes blazing with anger. It was not the first time he had witnessed his parents being treated this way, and each time it had left him with a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. Sophia pressed herself against Victoria's leg, her big brown eyes filled with worry. Mommy, why are these guys angry? She asked in a quiet voice that broke Alexander's heart. Before anyone could respond, the situation took a turn for the worse. A group of people appeared from around the corner, 2 security guards and, far more alarmingly, 2 police officers in full uniform. They were heading quickly towards the confrontation, and the expressions on their faces did not bode well. Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. He had worked with the police many times, respected their service. But at that moment, looking at the approaching officers, he felt a chill of fear, not for himself, but for his family. He knew all too well how such situations could unfold. The senior police officer, Officer Jenkins, judging by the badge on his chest, approached them with a stern expression on his face. We've received a report of a disturbance. I need to see your ID, he demanded without any greeting. Alexander maintained an outward calm, although inside he was constricted with bitterness and anger. He straightened up to his full, impressive height, meeting the officer's gaze. Officer Jenkins, there is no disturbance here. We are guests of this resort, vacationing with our family. I am FBI Special Agent Alexander Mitchell, and I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The mention of the FBI usually elicited respect and caution from local police officers, but Officer Jenkins merely sneered. Show me your ID. Right now, he demanded, completely ignoring Alexander's words. Victoria stepped forward, her legal training kicking in. On what basis do you demand my husband's ID? We have not committed any illegal actions. We are legal guests of this resort. Your request violates our civil rights. The second cop, a young officer named Ramirez, stood next to Jenkins, his hand pointedly resting on his holster. Ma'am, if you continue to obstruct the police investigation, we will be forced to take action, he warned, the threat in his voice barely concealed. Alexander realized that the situation was rapidly getting out of control. He looked at the children. Michael stood with wide eyes, his young face distorted by a mixture of fear and anger, and little Sophia was already starting to cry, frightened by the loud voices and aggressive poses of the adults. Deciding not to escalate the situation for the safety of his family, Alexander slowly pulled out his wallet, pulled out his FBI ID, and handed it to Officer Jenkins. Here's my identification, he said evenly. I'm Special Agent Alexander Mitchell, head of the FBI's Los Angeles Division's Counterterrorism Unit. Jenkins took the ID, glanced at it casually, and, to the shock of everyone present, actually threw it back to Alexander. It could be a fake, he said with disdain. I need a real ID, not some kind of ID you can buy in a gift shop. Victoria choked with indignation. What did you say? Her voice shook with rage. Are you accusing a federal agent of forging documents? Victoria, Alexander warned softly, seeing his wife begin to lose her composure. He understood her anger, shared it, but also knew that at this point, escalating the conflict could lead to catastrophic consequences. He turned back to the officer, trying to maintain a professional tone. Officer Jenkins, I understand you're doing your job. Here's my driver's license if you need further confirmation. He pulled out his license and handed it to Jenkins, who took it with a little more attention this time, but still returned it with obvious distrust. Sona, we are still waiting for confirmation from the resort administration that you are indeed guests. Until then, I ask you and your family to leave this area. This was too much. Victoria stepped forward, her patience exhausted. Enough, she cried, her voice full of fury. You are violating our civil rights, demonstrating blatant discrimination, and abusing your power. I am a civil rights attorney, and I promise you that if you continue this outrage, I will file a lawsuit against you that will destroy your career. Her words hung in the air, creating a tense silence around the pool. Other guests began to take notice of the conflict, some even taking out their phones to film what was happening. Officer Ramirez seemed annoyed by Victoria's confidence and legal threats. He took a quick step forward, his hand already on the handcuffs hanging from his belt. Sir, put your hands behind your back, he ordered Alexander, completely ignoring Victoria. Alexander froze, not believing his ears. Were they really going to arrest him in front of his wife and children? For what? For vacationing with his family at an expensive resort? Officer, this is a serious mistake, he warned, but Ramirez was already approaching with handcuffs. Hands behind your back, now, he repeated louder, attracting even more attention from those around him. Alexander looked at Victoria, her eyes filled with tears of anger and helplessness. He glanced at Michael, who was clenching his fists as if ready to rush to his father's defense, and at Sophia, who was already openly crying, clinging to her brother's leg. With a heavy heart and a bitter taste in his mouth, Alexander decided to comply rather than make the situation worse. He slowly turned around and put his hands behind his back, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking on his wrists. In that moment, he experienced a humiliation and helplessness he had never experienced before, even in the most dangerous FBI operations. Daddy! Michael cried, moving forward, but Victoria quickly grabbed his shoulder, holding him in place. Don't interfere, Michael, she warned, though her own voice shook with barely contained emotion. It'll be okay. I'll handle this. But in Michael's eyes, Alexander saw something that broke his heart. The first stirrings of the inequality and injustice that the boy would face for the rest of his life. That moment, that scene, would be part of his memories forever. His father, A hero, a federal agent, humiliated and handcuffed for no reason other than the color of his skin. Sophia clung to Michael, her small body shaking with sobs. Why are they taking Daddy away? Is he bad? She asked through tears, and every word she said was like a knife in Alexander's heart. Victoria, gathering all her courage and professionalism, stepped towards the officers, her voice icy with controlled rage. You are making a huge mistake, officers. You arrest a federal agent without cause, humiliate him in front of his family, and all this in front of dozens of witnesses with phones. Do you realize what a scandal this will be when it gets into the media? Officer Jenkins hesitated, the first look of doubt appearing on his face. He glanced around and noticed that many of the resort guests were indeed filming the scene on their smartphones. But Officer Ramirez didn't seem to care. Step aside, ma'am, or you too will be arrested for obstructing justice, he threatened, squeezing Alexander's hand tighter. At that moment, Alexander felt something inside him break. All the years of service, all the criminals he had caught, all the terrorist threats he had prevented. And here he was, handcuffed, humiliated, in front of his own children. The irony and bitterness of this situation was unbearable. But the worst thing was not the handcuffs or the humiliation. The worst thing was the eyes of his children. Eyes in which he saw fear, misunderstanding, and the first bitter lessons about the injustice of the world. This pain was stronger than any physical one. Michael took another step forward, his young face contorted with anger and determination. Let my father go, he demanded with unexpected strength in his voice. Michael, no, Victoria cried, holding her son back again. Please take Sophia aside. I'll handle this. But it was too late. Officer Ramirez had already started pushing Alexander toward the exit as if he were a common criminal. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's wrong!" Another voice added, "Racism!" But no one actively intervened. Victoria, seeing her husband being taken away, went on a full-scale offensive. "I demand that you call your superior immediately," she screamed, following the officers. "I demand an explanation. You are arresting a federal agent without cause, and I swear that every one of you will answer for this." Her voice attracted even more people's attention. Some of the resort's guests began filming the event more openly, and the whispers and indignant comments grew louder. Officer Jenkins seemed to realize that the situation was getting out of hand, and that the fuss surrounding the incident could have serious consequences. He attempted to calm the situation by addressing Victoria in a more conciliatory tone. "Ma'am, please calm down. We're just doing our job. If your husband really is who he says he is, everything will clear up quickly." But Victoria was beside herself with rage. "If," she asked, her voice shaking with indignation, "you just saw his FBI ID. What else do you want? A DNA test? Maybe a call to the FBI director?" Officer Ramirez still had Alexander in his arms, ready to lead him away. But Jenkins began to show signs of hesitation. He glanced around, noticing the crowd was becoming more hostile, and the number of phones pointed at them was increasing. At that moment, another figure appeared from around the corner, a tall man in an expensive suit with a resort manager's badge. He was approaching quickly, his face expressing extreme concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, taking in the situation. A federal agent in handcuffs, crying children, an angry wife, and a crowd of angry guests with phones at the ready. Victoria instantly turned her attention to the manager. "Your guards and these policemen are arresting my husband, a federal agent, without cause," she cried. "We are guests of your resort, number 712, and we demand an immediate end to this outrage." The manager turned pale, instantly realizing the gravity of the situation. He quickly approached the officers, his voice quieter but more insistent. "Officers, there has indeed been a mistake. The Mitchell family are our VIP guests. They arrived yesterday and have booked the presidential suite for a week." Jenkins hesitated even more, glancing at Ramirez, who was still holding Alexander. The situation had become critical. Further action could either diffuse the conflict or lead to a full-scale scandal. But Ramirez still didn't seem ready to admit his mistake. His face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and stubbornness. A classic case of a man who had gone too far and was now unable to back down without losing face. "We've received a call about violators," he insisted. "Protocol requires us to conduct a full investigation. You can't just show us any ID and expect us to accept it. There are procedures we have to follow." Victoria smiled sarcastically. "I wonder if you apply your procedures with the same zeal to all guests or only to certain families? The resort manager, clearly sensing the potential disaster for his establishment's reputation, became more insistent. Officer, I personally confirm that this family is our guest. There was a misunderstanding with our security, and I offer my deepest apologies. The call was a mistake. Victoria wasn't going to back down so easily. I don't want to hear about any misunderstandings or mistakes, she snapped. My husband is handcuffed, my children are hysterical, our vacation is ruined, and all because someone decided we don't look like people who can afford to vacation at your resort. Her words made many guests nod in agreement, and some even began to shout words of support. The situation was becoming increasingly public and scandalous. Jenkins, finally realizing the seriousness of his mistake, nodded to Ramirez. Take the handcuffs off him, he ordered quietly. Ramirez reluctantly complied, but his face was clearly displeased. He roughly removed the handcuffs from Alexander's wrists, not caring to do it carefully. Alexander rubbed his wrists, where there were red marks from the too tight handcuffs. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with a cool, controlled anger. 15 years of service in the FBI had taught him to hide his emotions in critical situations, but now a real hurricane raged inside him. There were moments when he looked into the eyes of the armed terrorists and didn't feel such rage. The humiliation in front of his family, in front of his children, it burned through him. He could have said everything he thought about the professionalism of these officers. He could have threatened them with consequences that would ruin their careers. But he also knew that escalating the conflict in front of his children would only deepen their trauma. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to focus on what mattered most, his family. Instead, he walked silently toward his children. Michael was still standing there, his face tense, his arms protectively around his sister, who was still sobbing. Alexander knelt down in front of them, trying to look calm even as a storm of emotion raged inside him. It's okay, guys, he said softly, holding out his hands to the children. It was just a misunderstanding. No one is going to take me away. Sophia immediately threw herself into his arms, clinging to his chest and continuing to cry. Michael followed her more slowly, his eyes full of questions and uncertainty. Why did they put handcuffs on you, Dad? He asked quietly. You didn't do anything wrong. Alexander felt his heart squeeze with pain. How to explain to a 12-year-old child the unfairness and prejudice of the world? How to protect him from the same fate? Sometimes people make mistakes, Michael, he answered softly. They judge others without knowing the whole truth. But we know who we are, and that's the main thing. But Alexander could see that his words had not convinced his son. There was an understanding in Michael's eyes that was beyond his years. He knew that this was not just a mistake. He was beginning to understand the dark reality of the world he had grown up in, and this realization was painful for Alexander. At this time, Victoria continued to confront officials, and her legal training was on full display. I want the names and badge numbers of every officer involved in this incident, she said, pulling out her phone and starting to write. I also want the full names of the security guards and the manager who called the police. This is going to be a big lawsuit, and I promise no one involved will get away with it. The resort manager looked increasingly alarmed, realizing that the situation could seriously damage the reputation of the Golden Shores. Mrs. Mitchell, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. The resort will fully compensate your stay and offer additional benefits. I don't want your privileges, Victoria cut him off. I want justice. My husband was humiliated, my children were traumatized, and you think you can just buy your way out of this? The manager looked confused, unsure of how else to calm the situation. The police officers, especially Ramirez, clearly wanted to leave the scene as quickly as possible, realizing that the situation had turned into a potential media scandal. Alexander, still holding his children, watched the scene with mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to just take his family and leave, forget about this humiliating incident, and try to salvage the rest of his vacation. But the other part of him, the FBI agent who had dedicated his life to justice, and the father who wanted to protect his children from similar situations in the future, knew that wasn't enough. He stood up, gently guiding the children towards Victoria, and walked towards the officers, his gait calm but determined. Officer Jenkins, Officer Ramirez, he said, his voice controlled and level. I want you to know that I understand you were doing your job, but what happened today goes beyond a simple misunderstanding. This was a clear display of bias and discrimination, and I cannot allow it to go unpunished. Jenkins started to say something about following protocol, but Alexander continued firmly. I will be filing a formal complaint with your department and informing my superiors at the FBI of what happened. You have endangered not only my dignity, but also the safety of my family." Ramirez tensed, apparently realizing the seriousness of the consequences that could affect his career. Alexander looked him straight in the eyes, not looking away. "Officer Ramirez, I've been involved with the police for many years, and I respect the people who truly serve and protect. But what you demonstrated today is nothing like true service. You acted out of prejudice, and it's actions like that that undermine the public's trust in the police." Ramirez clenched his jaw but said nothing, clearly aware that anything he said could be used against him. Jenkins looked more concerned, realizing that a complaint from a high-ranking FBI agent could have serious consequences for everyone involved. "Agent Mitchell," he began in a conciliatory tone, "we apologize for the inconvenience. There was a misunderstanding, and we—" "A misunderstanding?" Alexander interrupted, his eyes flashing with anger. "You call racial profiling and the illegal detention of a federal agent a misunderstanding? I highly doubt that a white family in that same pool would have experienced the same misunderstanding." His words silenced Jenkins, and Ramirez's face darkened with barely suppressed irritation. At that moment, Victoria approached the group, holding Michael and Sophia's hands. "We're leaving, Alex," she said firmly. "The children are frightened, and I think we've said enough. The rest will be handled through legal channels." Alexander nodded, realizing that further confrontation here, in front of the children, would do no good. He took one last look at the officers and the resort manager. "This is not the end," he said quietly, but with unwavering determination. "You will hear from us again." The Mitchell family began to gather their things, preparing to leave the pool area. Sophia was still sobbing quietly, and Michael stayed close to his father, as if afraid he might be taken away again. Victoria methodically folded books and towels, her movements mechanical, but her face was full of emotion. Alexander helped pack, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about how this incident would affect his children, especially Michael, who was old enough to understand what had happened. He was thinking about what he would say to his son, how he would explain that the world was not always fair, that sometimes you would be judged not by your actions, but by the color of your skin. These thoughts caused him almost physical pain. As a father, he wanted to protect his children from the cruelty of the world, but he also knew that sooner or later they would face the same prejudices that he and Victoria had faced all their lives. When they had finished getting ready, Alexander picked up Sophia, and Michael walked next to Victoria. They walked silently toward the exit, followed by the glances of the other guests, some sympathetic, others simply curious, and some clearly awkward, as if they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. But before they reached the exit, they were interrupted by a loud voice coming from the resort's public address system. "Agent Alexander Mitchell, please report to the main reception desk. You are expected." Alexander and Victoria exchanged surprised glances. Who could have expected them? Could this really be some new provocation? However, when they approached the reception desk, a surprise awaited them. There stood a tall man in an impeccable suit with a serious expression on his face. Alexander immediately recognized him. Deputy Chief of Police of Los Angeles, Richard Garcia. "Alexander," Garcia said, walking up to them and holding out his hand. "I came as soon as I heard. What the heck happened here?" Alexander shook Garcia's hand with mixed feelings of relief and surprise. "Richard, how did you know?" Garcia sighed, straightening his tie. I got a call from the office. One of the resort guests turned out to be a journalist. He contacted our press secretary and reported what happened. The video of the incident has already been sent to the editorial office. Given your status in the FBI and the seriousness of the charges, I decided to intervene immediately before the situation got completely out of control." Victoria stepped forward, her eyes still blazing with anger. "Antiti, then you should start by holding accountable your officers who decided they could arrest a federal agent without cause, just because he was black." Garcia nodded, his face serious. "Believe me, Mrs. Mitchell, I will personally look into this matter. What happened today is unacceptable. Officers Jenkins and Ramirez have already been suspended pending an internal investigation." This statement calmed Victoria down a little, but Alexander knew that this was only the beginning. The incident had already caused damage that would not be so easily repaired, especially the psychological damage to his children. Garcia turned to the resort manager, who was standing nearby, looking nervous. "I would also like to speak with the security guards who started this incident and with the person who called the police." The manager nodded, but his gaze was full of concern. Of course, Deputy Chief. We will cooperate fully with any investigation. Garcia turned again to Alexander and Victoria. I understand that you probably want to leave this place as soon as possible, and I will not detain you. But I will need to get your official statements for the report. Alexander nodded, but his attention was focused on the children. Sophia was still clinging to him, and Michael stood nearby, watching the proceedings with obvious incomprehension and confusion. We'll testify, Richard, Alexander said, but right now we need to take care of the children. They've been through enough. Garcia nodded understandingly, glancing at Michael and Sophia. Sure. Maybe I should come over to your house later, when things have calmed down a bit. That would be better, Victoria agreed, and we expect that all participants in this incident will be punished accordingly. I personally guarantee it, Garcia assured. At that moment, Sophia raised her head and looked at her father, her eyes still red from crying. Dad, can we go home? She asked in a quiet voice. I don't like it here. Alexander felt his heart clench in pain. Their first family vacation in a long time had been ruined by prejudice and discrimination. A place that should have been a source of joyful memories was now associated with fear and injustice in his children's minds. Yes, baby, we're going home, he answered softly, stroking her hair. Michael, who had been silent until then, suddenly spoke, his voice quiet but full of determination. Dad, they were wrong, he said, looking at his father. You didn't do anything wrong. They shouldn't have treated you like that. Alexander looked at his son, seeing a mixture of anger, confusion, and newfound wisdom in his eyes. The boy was growing up faster than he should have, and it was breaking Alexander's heart. You're right, Michael, he answered honestly. They were wrong, and that's why we won't stay silent. We'll fight for justice, not just for us, but for everyone who experiences similar injustice. Michael nodded, and a spark of determination appeared in his eyes that reminded Alexander of Victoria. Perhaps from this difficult experience, the boy would take away not only bitterness, but also an understanding of the importance of fighting for justice. The Mitchell family headed out of the resort, leaving behind shocked guests, a nervous manager, and a deputy police chief who had already begun a stern interrogation of officers Jenkins and Ramirez. As they walked through the main entrance, Alexander noticed several people filming them on their phones. News of the incident was spreading, and he knew it was just the beginning. Soon the story of a federal agent arrested for racial profiling would become public knowledge, and the full consequences would be impossible to predict. But right now his main concern was his family. Victoria, who walked beside him, her back straight, her head held high despite the storm of emotion she must be feeling. Michael, who suddenly looked older than his 12 years, with a new, more serious outlook on the world, and little Sophia still, clinging to him as if afraid that if she let go, he would be taken away again. They reached their car, a black SUV parked in the resort's VIP lot. Alexander carefully placed Sophia in the back seat, buckled her in, and turned to Michael. It's going to be okay, son, he said, looking the boy in the eyes. We'll get through this together, as a family. Michael just nodded, his eyes focused and serious. He sat down next to his sister and quietly took her hand, trying to calm her down, although he himself was obviously still in shock from what he had seen. Victoria sat in the front seat. Her movements were sharp, revealing her inner tension. As soon as Alexander got behind the wheel and started the engine, she finally allowed herself to release some of the accumulated emotions. I can't believe this happened, Alex, she said quietly, so the children wouldn't hear. In the 21st century, in California, to a federal agent and a civil rights lawyer. What happens to ordinary people who don't have our resources and connections? Alexander tightened his grip on the steering wheel, feeling the anger rising in him again. But he held it in, knowing that now was not the time for emotion. His family needed his strength and calm. That's why we can't let this go unpunished, Vika, he replied. Not just for our sake, but for the sake of all those who can't stand up for themselves. Victoria nodded, her eyes meeting his, and he saw the familiar fire of determination in them. In that moment, despite everything that had happened, he felt a surge of love and pride for his wife, a strong, fearless woman who never backed down from injustice. I already know what we're going to do, she said, pulling out her phone. First, I'll call Janet at her office and have her start preparing the lawsuit. Then I'll contact my friend at the Los Angeles Times. People need to know what's going on. Alexander nodded, knowing that it was useless to argue. When Victoria entered her justice fighter mode, it was impossible to stop her. And in this case, he was completely on her side. They drove out of the Golden Shores Resort, leaving behind a place that should have been a source of happy memories. but instead became a scene of humiliation and pain. Ahead lay a struggle, not only a legal one, but an emotional one, especially for their children. But Alexander was sure of one thing. They would fight together as a family, and they would not back down until justice was done. But inside him there remained a bitterness that was beyond words. A bitterness from the realization that neither his impeccable service in the FBI, nor the respect of his colleagues, nor all his achievements had protected him from humiliation and discrimination. He could protect the country from terrorists, but he could not protect his own children from the cruel reality of prejudice. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw Michael's reflection, looking out the window with an expression that was too mature for his age. At that moment, Alexander vowed to himself that he would do everything in his power to ensure that his children would live in a world where they would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But the road to that peace will be long and difficult, and today was just another reminder of how much more there is to go.